Welcome to Chapter 7. We're going to be talking about selecting employees. In Chapter 6, we talked about recruiting them. Now we're going to talk about selecting them. So let's jump right into Chapter 7. Some of the things that you should be able to learn, that you should grasp, and be able to speak intelligently about after reading Chapter 7 is your ability to outline the steps in the process of selection, describing aptitude, psychometer, job knowledge, proficiency, interest, and personality test, explaining a polygraph test, and describing structured and unstructured interviews, and defining validity. You should be able to explain predictive validity, concurrent validity, describe content validity, discuss construct validity, and be able to define reliability and adverse or disparate impact. So, when we talk about the selection process, this is when you're going to, you've gone through enticing people in, whether it was through ads or word of mouth, or you were on a campus doing some kind of recruiting, whatever. You've got these pool of candidates, and now you have gone through the process of interviewing, and you need to choose amongst those candidates who's most likely to successfully perform the job that you need done at the level and standards that you've set. And so there are various prerequisites that are and should be aligned for that process. The job analysis, HR planning, and recruitment. So let's look at these steps. I will expand this. So we start off with our completion and screening of the application form. You do your preliminary interview, employment testing, diagnostic interview, reference checking, and that's usually the physical examination of the references. And those are required for anyone who's actually offered the position. And that should be contingent upon that individual passing any kind of physical examinations, drug tests, blah, 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 whatever. And actually, then it goes into the final decision. Now, I have grown to embrace more of the concept of be slow to hire and quick to fire. And what that means is that sometimes organizations are quick to hurry up and get through this selection process. And what happens is that you miss a lot of red flags from those candidates. So you quickly hire them, and then what happens is after you've gone through the process of training them and you've invested so much money in them and you realize that, oh my goodness, this is the wrong candidate, you sometimes are very slow to get them out of the organization. That is costly on many levels. So I would say that when you go through that preliminary interview, and then you have your employment testing and a diagnostic interview, and then you have the reference checking. There should be, if that diagnostic interview isn't a series of interviews, then there's a problem because you may push through it too quickly. So it's making sure that if you have, for instance, there's this one company that I applied for, and we had like 5 interviews, and I thought it was so ignorant. But when I look back now, years later, it made a lot of sense. It was a high-profile position. It was a position that it required me to have various licenses and government clearance and so on and so forth, these extensive background checks. And I was going to have an impact on millions of dollars of client investments. So no, it's not good enough. There's only 2 interviews. So as each interview process, it was more and more intense. And that's where it happened in that diagnostic interview phase. That is where, they really would dig deep. And if you didn't make it past the one interview, you just weren't going on. They weren't going to waste the time to get, to keep going to figure out. They're not going to hire you and then realize you're not to the caliber that we need. So now that I look back, 2020 is hindsight, it was very valuable to them to put us through that many stages. So I would recommend that any company should have at least 3 interviews, right? At least 3 interviews. 5, 6 max. And the 5, 6 are for really high level or super sensitive positions. Folding envelopes or folding informationals to put in an envelope, I don't think requires 5 interviews. That should be the standard, 2, 3 interview process. But the higher up, the more the job is, the more risks that the company has to take on you, the more I think that you should be interviewed to make sure that you're the right fit. So we have our application form. These things are so irritating. You fill out your application form, you submit it. Then when you come in for a job, you have to turn around and fill out another one. Or, you send in your resume. Well, everything you need is on my resume. Why I have to then put the same information on the application? So irritating. But that's usually your first step. And it, gives them the basic information. This is how we screen unqualified applicants. It helps eliminate any pre-employment inquiries dealing with race, color, origin of your nationality, any religion, any convictions and arrests that you have, and credit rating. Yes, everyone's using credit now. They're trying to find ways to disqualify candidates because there ends up being so many. And interesting enough, credit also is one way that you can skate around any other discriminatory practices that your organization may be involved with. I'm just saying. Because you can oftentimes guess a person's race or national origin based on their name. So if I then wanted to discriminate against you based on that, but I'm like, gosh, that's not good enough. Well, one way is if I pull your credit and your credit is 400. Nope, not qualified. We need you to have a 700 or greater. Really not sure how that has impact, but it does say something. It speaks volumes to us about who you are as a person and what you value and how honorable you are, and that you pay your debts and blah, 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 blah. So yes, it speaks to that, but it can also be used to discriminate against candidates. So now, arrest and conviction records. Courts have said that your arrest record is an unlawful basis to refuse hire unless you can show that such a policy is job related. And once again, a lot of organizations are discriminating, and there's no way for them. They can't show it. They're not showing it. They're just doing it. And they may come up with something else, or they come up with different things. But when it comes to credit rating, also, like I mentioned earlier, it's being used. It's unlawful, and you have to be able to say that it's a business necessity for it to be established. Now, if you are working in the financial services industry, a financial advisor, yes, you should have a high credit score. You just really, it makes sense that you do if you're teaching on it, training on it, whatever. I don't think that it necessarily needs to be in the 800s, but I do think it should be above, 500, unless you can justify, I was going through divorce, this would happen, blah, 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 I was sick, whatever, whatever, whatever. But for the most part, it's kind of hard to convince someone that you're good with money and making financial decisions when your credit reflects otherwise. So, but you can see how all of these actually play into organizations discriminating against people. Now, there's a processing of these application forms, and they're weighted, and they are assigned different weights or values based on different questions that are asked. And then that's how you help to weed through, and then you go through to see how accurate the information is. Can you verify the references? And there may also be a statement sheet that you have to sign that declares that what is included on your application and what you've said are all valid statements sworn, under penalty of perjury, blah blah blah. And if you falsify any information on your application form, it can, if they find out, if you've been hired and they find out, they can fire you. And in some cases, depending on how egregious the act that you committed, they can actually file a lawsuit against you or file charges for one or different infractions. Now, working in HR, you'll hear about an applicant flow record. And maybe in your organization, it may have a different terminology attached to it. But what it is, it's a form that an applicant fills out voluntarily. And as the employer, you use it to get certain information that could be used to illegally discriminate against that applicant. You heard that right. It's used by an employer to obtain information that could be used to illegally discriminate. Yeah. So read more about that in your textbook. So let's go through the preliminary interview. We're going to look at your skills, your abilities, any kind of job preferences, and how they match what we're preferring our candidates to have, and also how your preferences align with what available jobs that we have to offer you. It helps to explain about what jobs are available, the requirements of the job, the requirements of the individual in general within the organization, and specifically as it relates to that job. It helps answer any questions that you may have about that particular job or any other jobs that we are offering, as well as any questions that you have about the company and the people that make up the company. Then you go through formal testing, and there's different types of commercial tests that are used. You have your mental measurements yearbook, and that's a wide variety of commercial tests that are summarized, and you get some evaluation by different experts. And we have our aptitude test, where we're going to measure your capacity or ability to learn and perform a job. It could be verbal, numerical, spatial. We have the psychometer test, which measures your strength and dexterity and coordination. We look at your speed of arm movement, manual dexterity, your wrist finger speed. And then another test is your job knowledge, and it measures how much knowledge you actually have about a particular job that you're applying for. And this is usually this is very helpful, especially when you have people that claim to have experience working in a particular field or specific kind of job. Those job knowledge tests are very helpful. It helps to weed out those who may think they have the experience, those that know they don't have experience and they're lying about it, as well as it helps to highlight and bring to the front those people that definitely have experience. And then a proficiency test will measure how well you can do a sample of the work that needs to be performed. So you go from having what knowledge of a specific job to breaking down to how well you can actually do the job itself. The interest test looks at your interest compared to the interest of successful people that are already working in that specific job and how those align and whether or not you actually mesh well. Then the personality test is going to try to measure your traits. It can be difficult because some people do, you know, fudge a little and try to be, um, you know, try to mask any kind of negative personality traits. But these tests are also known as like the ink blot test. You have the Research ink blot test, the TAT test. So they really try to go in and see whether or not if they can weed out potential candidates who could have any kind of meltdowns or, be on the next episode of Snapped or things of that nature. So to help weed out things that could potentially cause a lot of problems within an organization. If you have someone who is a bully by nature, it's possible that you can pull that through in a test to see they may not mesh well. To look and see that a person is an absolute narcissist, that may not work well in your environment. And so being able to pull these things out can be very helpful and beneficial. Polygraph, lie detector. 99.9% of you have heard about it. I don't know how many of you have actually experienced the use of one, but it's going to record your physical changes in your body based on the questions that you ask. And there's the EPP Act of 1988 that prohibits organizations from conducting these exams on all applicants and most employees. And it prevents the use of the voice stress analyzers and similar devices that try to measure your honesty. Why? Because people's stress, if you're attaching some kind of device to me, my stress levels are automatically going to be apparent. And so that's not going to really gauge whether or not I'm being honest or dishonest. And some people have been wrongly terminated, convicted of doing all kinds of things based on the use of polygraph and analyzers. It does not, however, prohibit paper and pencil tests and chemical testing, such as tests to see whether or not you're on drugs or you have HIV/AIDS, so on and so forth. Then there's a handwriting analysis test, which is called a graphology, and that is you looking at your handwriting to assess your personality. I have not personally taken a graphology test. I think that would be a very long process, because that has to then be sent out to an expert. I'm not sure what kind of job would require that. It definitely has to be a high-risk job that would actually do handwriting analysis to determine whether or not you have their personality trait is conducive to the environment that you need to work in. Then, as I mentioned earlier, you have your drugs and AIDS testing. And then there's tests that look at the current employees when their job performance suggests substance abuse, and all new potential employees. Let's see. Oh, there we go. I was wondering where that was on my slide. So, although there's consensus that exists that restricts healthcare benefits is not the goal of genetic testing, all parties are concerned about who will have access to information. And another concern of employers is what liability they may have for not using genetic testing if a valid test and a reason for testing exists. And so, they'll use gene coding and all sort of thing to see how susceptible you are to illness, so on and so forth. But right above that, you see the Vocational Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Both of those protect the jobs of people that are living with HIV/AIDS. And it's so imperative because you have a lot of discriminatory practices, but you also have a lot of bullying and harassment that takes place. And so both of these acts are in place to protect workers. Now, I've already talked about this. Now, you then have your second or follow-up interview, and this can be a second and a third, interview. And this is where you can get some supplemental information about the selection process, ask specific questions that are concerning the job itself, and that's also where the candidate would ask specific questions to the interviewer about the job. There will be limitations on the types of questions that can be asked, and that is placed by the EEOC and legislation that makes sure that you don't then get into questions about, like for instance, wondering whether or not an applicant is ever considering having children, because having children would mean that applicant in the workplace would be distracted, could end up missing days of work, so on and so forth. And we really don't want to have that kind of financial burden placed upon us. So we really are trying to find a way to keep prospective and new parents out. So, or even people that just have kids in general. So what they'll ask you, oh, do you have any kids? That's really none of your business. It has nothing to do with the job itself. Unless, of course, you're working at a company that there's kids there. Then it's kind of a natural inclination to inquire whether or not the applicant has children, or whatever. But for the most part, it's steering away from that. It's steering away from whether or not an applicant is married, who they're married to, is it same sex, so on and so forth. So those are things that cannot be brought up by the interviewer in an interview. So we have structured and unstructured interviews, and in the structured interview, there's an outline that should be followed, and there's specific questions that should be covered, and there are different variations. You have a semi-structured interview that will use an outline but may allow some ebb and flow, allow some adjustments where you may not have to go down the list. A situational interview is where I may present a certain scenario and try to gauge how well you can solve the problem, provide a solution, so on and so forth. In your unstructured interview, there's no predetermined checklist. There's really no systematic coverage of any information. There are more probabilities of personal biases being brought up by the interviewer because there's no structure. It allows that person to kind of freestyle, and with that, that is when you most likely will float into asking questions that are inappropriate and illegal and possibly unethical. There are different types of interviews. We have a stress interview that puts you under pressure to see how you handle stress, how highly emotional you can become when you're placed under stress. There's a board or panel interview that has 2 or more people that conduct the interview with you. A group interview is where several applicants are questioned together. That can be an interesting dynamic as well. I've been in 2 of the 3 interviews. I don't recall ever being put in a stress interview that I can recall. I may have, I just can't think of it right now. So here's some problems that we face when we conduct interviews. First, you have your initial impression, and this can be a doozy because you'll draw conclusions about that person within the first 10 minutes of the interview. So based on how they speak, how they are dressed, their body language, the smell of their perfume or cologne, possibly the smell of their breath or any other body odor, how their resume looked, whatever. That can be a problem because I've now summed you up, I've already labeled you, I've judged you before I've actually gotten a chance to really know you. The halo effect happens when you allow a prominent characteristic of that employee to influence your judgment in the performance appraisal. Right? There could be something that stands out and you focus on that. And that characteristic can be personality, it could be physical. Overgeneralizing is when you may not behave exactly the way you would on the job during the interview. So you're overly articulate and you are bubbly personality and you're laughing and you're talking about how much of a team player you are and you're blah 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 and you're doing everything it takes in order to sell yourself. You are presenting your representative, but you're not presenting your true self. So you're selling yourself to get the job, but you're not keeping it real so that I know as the interviewer whether or not you really are a match. So those take place. Other problems, of course, are personal preferences, our own prejudices, and our biases. And interviewers with biases or prejudices tend to look for behaviors that conform to those biases. So, as I mentioned earlier, you can have the appearance. There's the concept of social status, how someone dresses, their race, their gender. If all of a sudden I start to pick up on whether or not I think that you are a member of the LGBTQ community, I may be prejudiced about that, and so that can actually have a negative influence on the interview. And those are all red flags. Those are all no-nos, and it happens so often. It happens so often. And it's sad because you don't always know. Interesting enough, I remember, and I've shared this before, I remember when I was about 18, I applied for a job and I did a phone interview. The manager told me over the phone I was hired. She loved me. I was hired. I came in and it was like a lingerie store or something of the sort. I remember they had lingerie in there. I think it was a lingerie store. It was either a lingerie store or it was a beauty supply store. One of the two. Either way, I had my hair in braids, and they were in individual braids. And I remember some other employees were in there, and everyone was excited to meet me. And when the manager met me, and she said, "I'll never forget." Oh, I hope I never forget. She says, "Oh, it may be a problem. Wouldn't your braids get in the way of like your work, like what you could do?" And I casually said, "No. Why would they? If anything, I'll just pull them back in a ponytail or put it in a bun. Like, no, I don't see a problem." And she's like, "Ugh, yeah, I don't think it's gonna work. I think that your braids would get in the way. I don't, yeah, this isn't the position for you." And one of the other employees blurted out and said, whatever the manager's name was, "That's not true. How would her hair's not a factor. What does her hair have to do with anything? We're not serving food, and if we were, there's a hairnet." And she like hurried up and hushed that employee. I didn't realize at the time, like it knocked the wind out of me, but I didn't realize at the time that I could have actually went and reported her to the labor board in California for discriminating against me, so on and so forth. I could have pressed that. I could have, but I was just so hurt. I walked out of that store. I remember getting in the car and I cried and I went home. I told my parents, like I was just, but I was not old enough, mature enough to really understand that I had been discriminated against and had been offered a position sight unseen. Once she saw me, and I think what it was over the phone, she couldn't tell I was African American. Then she saw me. She couldn't just discriminate against me just because of the color of my skin. So she had to find something. And what she found was, what did I say about the appearance? She focused on my braids. So that's just an example. So here's how you can have an effective interview process. Being careful to pay attention to what is being said, that you are not focusing on the appearances and things like that. You're not letting your biases and prejudice come in, but you're also making sure that the careful attention is given to selecting and training interviewers. Right? Just because a person has a position does not mean that they are good at interviewing people. Just because you're a manager, you got pushed up to manager, does not mean that you are a good interviewer. So making sure that those people are properly selected and trained. That you're planning for the interview should include an outline that specifies what information you need to receive from the applicant and what questions that you're going to ask of him or her. And as the interviewer, you should attempt to put those individuals that you are interviewing at ease. Make them feel comfortable. Make them feel welcome. Help reduce their stress and anxiety, because you do know that there is some stress and anxiety. Making sure that you obtain facts that is recorded immediately, because you don't have time to try to remember what was said. Take notes, record it, whatever. Making sure that you have it so you can review it later. And all of the effectiveness and everything, it should be evaluated. You should be constantly making sure that your interview process runs smoothly. It covers the bases, that it is as aggressive as it needs to be based on the specific jobs that are being recruited for. And so you need to make sure you stay on top of that process. And that could mean that you have other qualified people listening in on your interviews, sitting in on the interviews, things of that nature, to get a grasp of how it's going and how well not only the process is, but how well your interviewers are. So when we talk about reference checking, this is a big one for me because it's so funny how many people go through the process of getting your list of references and then they never check, right? You're not contacting those personal references in schools and past employers. Like, what's the purpose in having people do it if they're not going to follow through? And knowing that most applicants are not going to list someone as a reference if that person's not going to give them a positive recommendation. So you know that the personal reference has limited value, right? You already know they're going to say great things. School references may be limited for similar reasons, because sometimes people will list their previous or their current instructors. So those can also have a limited value. When you look at past employment, it is most often used source, right? It's most often used, and they're in a position to supply the most objective information. Previous, and then of course the influence. It's also influenced significantly by government legislation, the whole process of checking one's references. Now, the Privacy Act of 1974 prevents government agencies from making employment records public without the consent of the individual involved. So we have to actually make sure that and that's because why? If it's you make it public and you don't get my say and people have all this information about me, that leaves me exposed to so many different issues. So this act is so valuable. Then, of course, FCRA is your Fair Credit Reporting Act. That's 1971. It requires that private organizations give job applicants access to information that they receive from any kind of reporting service. And it mandates that you acknowledged that the credit check, or the was being made. Now, when we do the physical examinations, this is usually done based on you pass this exam, and then I'm going to offer you the job. And I just need to make sure that you're physically capable of performing the job. And this exam will also let us know whether or not you're eligible or ineligible for any life, health, or disability insurance that we provide. So we go through all of that, and now we're ready to make a final selection decision. We have these candidates, everyone's made it to this point. Now we have to decide who's going to get the job. It's your final step. It's based on your judgment, and you're going to take all of the information that you've had that were gathered from the previous steps, and if you perform those previous steps successfully, efficiently, then it makes it easier for you to now make this final decision. This step is assigned to different levels of management in different organizations, so it's not always the same level with an organization that makes these decisions. In some organizations, it's done frontline for frontline employees, and some your mid-level managers make the decisions for who's hired frontline. Some organizations, it's the top-level managers make the decisions based on all top-level and mid-level employees. So it really is just it really depends on the organization. Then we look at our validation of the selection procedures. So what is the criteria of job success? And that's how we specify the successful performance of the job and how it's measured. We're looking at the performance appraisals. We're looking at production and your productivity, how many widgets you're actually cranking out. We're looking at personal data. Then we look into criterion predictors, and that's your education, any previous work experience, how well you scored on tests, using that information to basically predict how successfully you think that you're going to perform the job. Then validity and reliability. Excuse me, tongue-tied. Validity is how accurately a predictor actually predicts your success, the criteria of job success. Reliability is going to refer to the extent to which the criterion predictor produces consistent results if repeated measurements are made. So how reliable it is that it's consistently being done. Validity is whether or not it's an actual prediction is accurate. Reliability is that you're producing this consistent result repeatedly. So figure 7.2 is looking at the relationship between job analysis and validity, and I will expand this. And you see job specification is going to facilitate the development of criterion predictors. Job description is going to facilitate the development of criteria of job success. So looking at job description, some of those examples would include performance appraisals, personnel data, looking at your tardiness, absenteeism, and turnover. Job specification is some of the examples are education, performance appraisals, and results from employment interviews. That's all funneled into the specification and description are funneled into reliability and validity. So I mentioned a moment ago about criterion-related validity, and that's established by collecting data and using a correlation analysis to determine the relationship between a predictor and the criteria of job success. So we are looking at the correlation between what we predict, how well we predict someone to succeed in a job, the criteria of what success looks like on the job. And there are some primary methods that are used, both predictive and concurrent. Predictive validity is established by identifying a predictor, and you're going to administer it to applicants, and you're being hired without regard to scores. So there's a correlation of the scores with job performance. There are some drawbacks because it can cost a lot. It's a slow process to complete. It requires a lot of employees to be hired at the same time, regardless of their test scores, and there needs to be an equivalent orientation and training for all of those employees. So it's time consuming, it's costly, and it's a very, very slow process. When we look at figure 7.3 of the predictive validation process, I'm going to expand this a little so you can see. That may be too much actually. Hold on a second. That's close enough. So we have our job applicants, and then they receive a test. If the scores are criterion predictor, they then go to correlation analysis. If not, and then from there you look at the degree of correlation. If not, then the applicants are hired without regard to how well they scored on their test. Then new employees receive their basic orientation and training. They perform the job, there's a time delay, then they look at the production records or any performance evaluations to see how well they align with the criterion of job success. That is analyzed, and then you get the degree of correlation. So that is how predictive validation works. Now, concurrent validity, you are identifying the predictor. You're going to administer it to your current employees, and then you're going to correlate the test data with your current employees' job performance. The drawbacks are that women and minorities will not be adequately represented, and poor performers tend to quit or they're terminated from their job, and the best performers have frequently been promoted. I'm going to zoom in on this chart so we can look at concurrent validation. And you can see where you have your present employees. They go through the test, and it's usually those who are holding a specific job type. Those scores are criterion predictor. So they go through the correlation analysis, and there's a degree of correlation. Job performance of present employees, they look at the production records or evaluation, and those are used as the criterion of job success. That's then analyzed, and then you get your degree of correlation. Now, content validity. This is the extent to which the content of a selection procedure or specific instrument that is designed is representative of important aspects or elements of job performance, and is useful in situations where the number of employees is not large enough to justify the use of empirical validation methods. Construct validity, on the other hand, measures the degree to which the candidates have identifiable characteristics, and it's important for successful job performance. So it's looking at space visualization, verbal ability, perceptual speed, so on and so forth. Reliability, we talked about it earlier. We're going to reinforce it here. We are reproducing the results with a criterion predictor. So it's a concept of test retest. So one method where we are looking at the reliability of a test and then involving a group of individuals that we're going to test and give the same group that test all over again. So we're going to test you once and then retest you again to see how the results change, stay the same. Then we also have a parallel or alternative forms where you're giving two separate but similar forms of a test out. That is interesting to be able to see how well the test is, the success of the test, and how well candidates did on the test. Then we have split halves, and that's where you divide the test into halves and administer it that way. There are some uniform guidelines on employee selection procedures where you have to provide the framework for determining the proper use of tests and other selection procedures before making a decision. And the decision can be hiring, promotion, to demote an employee, referral, retention of employees, any licensing and certification that needs to be done, selection for training, and transferring employees to other departments, teams, locations, so on and so forth. They contain technical standards and documentation requirements for validation of selection procedures. And then, of course, we're looking at criteria-related content and construct validity studies. All of those are permitted. Now, there can be an adverse or disparate impact that can occur. And that usually happens when the selection rate for women or minorities is less than 80% of the selection rate for the majority group. And so this can happen, and when we talk about minorities, oftentimes in the United States, we're thinking that the majority group are white, but let's flip it on its head. You can have a case where you are the majority group. You could be Asian, Latino. You could also be African American. You could be Native American. And so you are then the majority group and looking at the selection process of other minorities when it's less than 80%. The same is if the vast majority of your group are men, and if less than 80% is a representation of women, then you have an adverse impact. And this is in the hiring process within promotions, transfers, those individuals that are demoted from a position, or any selection decision that's being made. So when we look at adverse impact, we have what's considered a 80% rule, or the 4/5 rule, and limit used to determine whether or not there are serious discrepancies in hiring decisions and any other employment practices that are taking place that affect women or minorities. Figure 7.5 shows you determining adverse impact in an employer's workforce. And here is 25% of African Americans in relevant labor market. Adverse impact calculations, 4/5 of 25% is 20%. African American employment rate below 20% indicates adverse impact. Then over here you see there's 10% African Americans in the employer's workforce. There's a 26% adverse impact that exists. So you see how this looks visually. Now, when you look at your adverse impact in the hiring decisions, you have a selection rate for men, and that's 60%. The adverse impact calculation is looking at the female employment rate is below 48%. At that point, that is an adverse impact, right? Because the adverse impact calculation is 4/5, or what is 60% of 60%, which is 48%. That's how you come up with that. So the moment that number drops below 48, and of the number of females that are actually hired, there's adverse impact. The selection rate for women is 25%, so there's a 23% adverse impact that exists. So you're looking at the 48% is what indicates adverse. If only 25% of women were actually selected, you see that there is a 23% adverse impact rate. So where does it exist? And there's some basic options. As an employer, you have the option to modify or eliminate various procedures that will produce that adverse impact. You do have to justify use of the procedure on grounds of job relatedness when you fail to modify or eliminate the procedure. So if you continue doing it, you have to be able to justify it and how what the procedure that you're doing is related to the job itself. So make sure you go back. I know there's certain areas that are tongue twisters, some that are very weighted in general, and if need be, I will be able to expand on those in future videos upon your request. All right, so with that, this ends chapter 7.